Thank you. Alright, so welcome to the Yale IV 2016 final. Let's go ahead and start off with congratulating our teams in the final. In opening government, we have Swarthmore MP. In opening opposition of Harvard BD. In closing government, Stanford EL. And in closing opposition, Bates SGD. Before we get started, are all teams consenting to being filmed this round? Obviously, you can revoke your consent post-round. Good? Yeah? Yeah? Cool, awesome. I'm just going to use gender-neutral pronouns. Anyone have any problems with that? No? Cool, awesome. Let's go ahead and get started. On my panel, there's me, I'm Matalib, and I'll let my panelists introduce themselves.
Hi, I'm Evan Linia.
Hi, Moniaz. Henry.
Ben.
And Tim.
Cool, awesome. So without further ado, I'd like to call upon the Prime Minister to give a speech not to exceed 7 minutes, and the motion that bears their name. Here, here.
Members of the panel, despite what the godless heathens on side opposition will tell you, we say in this round that not only does God exist, but that even if we are unsure if God exists, it is preferable for individual humans to decide that God exists, and it is the only way for a human being to live a truly meaningful life, or at least many humans live a meaningful life, and therefore you as an individual do believe in God. But also we're going to talk about why God exists, and we think insofar as unless side opposition actually proves to you that God does not exist, and that is the burden on them, then you should default to deciding that, at the very least, we should decide if we are preferable for God to exist. We do not have to prove absolutely that God exists in order to win this debate. So, a few things I want to say. First of all, what is God? We had a pretty long discussion about this. So, this is the definition I came up with. I'm free to have some quick clarification. So, we think that God, the first round, is a conscious force that operates on a plane of existence above our own physical plane, that creates and exerts control over our physical reality. Are there any clarifications?
Is he omnipotent?
Yes, we are saying God is omnipotent.
Question. Do you think God is constrained by the laws of logic?
The laws of logic? I will say that I cannot begin to understand that question. But I look forward to you explaining that with logic. So, first thing, why is it at least highly probable that God exists? First, the problem of something from nothing. We think, based on the known and even potentially logically feasible law of the physical universe, it is impossible for something to come from nothing. So it's impossible to understand how carbon atoms can arise from a world where literally nothing exists in some sort of vacuum of any physical material. Given that that is the case, we think it is required that a higher plane of existence intervenes to create that world. We think that the existence of God is somewhat akin to someone living in a simulation of conscious being. So, for example, we think that if at some point in the extreme advancement of an intelligent society, an individual were able to create a simulation made up of conscious individuals, were to design that simulation with certain basic rules that let's call the rules of physics and the rules of logic, and those people were continued to exist, and that person could exert control, that person would be God. And we think that is similar to what's likely to happen if there was a God in our sort of house. I'll take it later. Given that, we think that sort of world is a far more plausible explanation of coexistence than any sort of other argument for how physical reality was constructed. Because we do not think it makes sense, given that only our physical plane of reality exists, that anything exists at all, because based on the laws of physics, something must have caused the initial physical existence of an object. Second of this, why do we think that in particular consciousness in humanity requires a God existence? We say that based on scientific analysis, it is colossally unlikely that the exact combination of physical material and the exact chain of events cause the human mind and human consciousness. We think it is impossible to overstate how unlikely this is. I will try and fail to overstate it to make this clear in this round, because the human mind cannot even comprehend the unlikelihood of the existence of humanity and human consciousness. Given how colossally unlikely it is, we think any other explanation, the existence of God, is a far less implausible explanation. Insofar as giving you plausible reasons to believe in the existence of God, and I've shown that it is more plausible than any other cause for than the other things that happen to create human existence. That is something that you ought to believe. So second, even what is belief, and does something have to exist in order to believe in it? Because we think we're going to prove my third point, why even if God doesn't exist, you should believe in God. So we think that belief is not based on absolute fact and can never actually be based on absolute fact. A few reasons. First of all, there's only two ways of believing something to be real: based on your sensory experiences or based on your internal logical reasoning. In terms of sensory experiences, we argue that they can never be trusted to construct purely rational beliefs because everyone views the world in a different way based on certain factors. So for example, I do not know that you see red in the way that I see red. And there's often much more common bias as well, as far as someone who has one ideological upbringing and someone who has a different ideological upbringing sees facts in different ways. The fact of the matter is that because we cannot even know, for example, that other people even exist, because it is impossible to prove that other people are thinking in the way that you are thinking. Given that, it is impossible to make beliefs that are purely rational based on objective reality. But second of all, we think it's impossible to construct beliefs purely based on logical reasoning, because of the fact that it is impossible to logically understand exactly how the world was created. Unless Up can show you a way to logically construct the existence of the physical universe, I do not think it is possible to show that there's an a priori belief that God does not exist. Insofar as that's the case, we say that beliefs are on their side would be purely instrumental. So third thing we want to talk about, I will take that now.
So why should uncertainty mean we automatically defer to a belief in God?
Yeah, so that's going to be my third point, which is about why it's preferable to believe in God. It's clear, but also we think it is more likely actually that God exists than doesn't exist based on effort. So the third point, why is it important that individuals believe in God? We say that if you in a world where you believe God does not exist, and that this is all there is massive amounts of isolation and existential incapacitation. What does this mean? We say that someone a belief should allow someone to live a meaningful life. We say that a life that has meaning is a life for someone who feels that they have relevance in the world, that there's a reason that they exist. Because if someone feels like there is no reason that they exist, and that there is no implication of their existence, then they feel that their life is wasted. So this doesn't have to mean someone designs your existence, but it doesn't mean you have some sort of impact on the world. We say in a world where God does not exist, that impact is practically zero. What does that mean? It means that in a world where the universe is infinite, your life has no impact on that universe. You could kill millions of people, or you could save the lives of millions, but in the grand scheme of infinite time and infinite space, that will have no implications. Second, we say that in a world where God doesn't exist, there's no conception of an absolute morality. Not even absolute morality, but any sort of morality beyond what individual people do. If you do not understand that there are things that are considered intrinsically right or intrinsically wrong, then no action has any sort of meaning. Because in order to take action, you need to decide whether an action is good or bad, and you can only do that in a world where intrinsic morality exists. If you do not know whether an action is good or bad, there's never any reason to act. Lastly, we say free will can only exist in a world without God, because God can choose to let people choose. For example, we know that in the Garden of Eden, God, in this story, is God let them choose. Because God operates beyond the laws of nature, God can break the physical barriers to free will. Those physical barriers to free will say that chemically we are determined based on the physical realities of the universe to act in a certain way. And so far as we think that understanding of some level of free will is important for the ability to live and experience the world, because if you do not have free will, then your life is basically meaningless and you're operating out of program. God can selectively choose to break those physical realities and allow free will. Because God exists, and because even if He doesn't, even if God doesn't, not that God is gendered, God should exist based on reality. For all these reasons, very proud to report.
I'd like to think that speaking for their remarks or call upon the leader of opposition to open the case for the opposition bench. Here.
Get me an iPad. Pad down. We think that the standard for epistemic belief is what is the best explanation that logically makes sense given the evidence that exists. In the absence of evidence to suggest something, we think we should default to disbelief rather than belief. Why is this the case? If I've never met Michael, if you default to belief rather than disbelief, then I automatically I'm contradicting myself. Why is that? Because then I will automatically default both to the belief that he's a good person and to the belief that he's a bad person. That's a mutually contradictory thing which cannot be true of the world. Therefore, it cannot be that we default to belief. If we default to disbelief instead, which is to say that if I've never met Michael, I assume nothing about his morality or whether he's a good person or a bad person, that allows me to wait till I meet him to find out whether he's good or bad. That's why we think it always has to be disbelief rather than belief. What do they give you before I move on to my constructive arguments? First thing they tell us is that it logically makes sense for God to be here, for God to exist, because nothing can come from nothing. A couple of problems with this. We're going to tell you that the best explanation is that the universe has simply been around forever. The universe is eternal. The reason their argument that you need God to explain that the universe came from somewhere makes no sense. Because if nothing comes from nothing, then that's infinitely regressive, which is to say, then God needs to have come from somewhere, and someone needs to have created God, and then someone needs to have created that God. No, thank you. The second problem with this is that within the conceptions of God that exist within the world, this is contradictory and makes no sense. What are we talking about? Within Hinduism, for instance, the concept of God and concept of time is cyclical, which is to say that God creates and creates and destroys. Within Christianity, time is linear, which is to say that God created the world at one point and then it continued to exist. Both of these can't be true at the same time because of the fact that if God exists, it can only be one of these. We think the simplest explanation is that these are stories that were created because of the fact that humans were scared of what was going on around them and not being able to understand it, and therefore to make sense of it, they created these stories. The problem with all of their analysis in their third argument about how life has no meaning unless we believe in God and so on and so forth would make sense in a debate titled "This House Would Believe in God," but this is a debate about whether or not we should believe in God from the perspective of the evidence that exists, and we think that there's no evidence to suggest that there's no evidence to suggest that God exists. The next thing they tell us is that you can't trust sensory belief, and therefore our standard of evidence doesn't make sense. Look, if everyone is experiencing different things, and I could be speaking to a bunch of brains in a vat right now, this is a silly debate to be having because it's inadjudicable. You might as well give us the debate and we can go and have a beer instead. Maybe not have a beer, whatever it is that we're having. So we have to accept that things exist, and given that they accept that logic exists and God is constrained by that, given the evidence that exists, what are the logical conclusions? First, the idea of an omnipotent God is internally contradictory. If you assume that a greatest possible being exists, can that greatest possible being create something so hot that God can't touch it? Either he can, in which case we think it means that God is not all-powerful, but they claim that omnipotence is a characteristic of this God, or they can't, in which case he's not omnipotent, and that destroys the logical thing that exists. But the second thing we tell you is the problem of evil, right? If God exists, and if everything we know about God from the text that God has left us is true, then God cares about human beings. The problem is that so much pain and evil exists that God could easily get rid of. Things like disease, things like destruction, wars, famine, this debate tournament, all of these are things are necessary physical experiences that God could have easily avoided if they wanted to do so. The problem is that they buy into this argument, right? They believe that God cares about human beings because they say, oh, God created free will so that people could figure out what was right and wrong and then come to God. The problem is, if free will is true, then God isn't all-powerful either. Because if free will is true, then God doesn't know whether I'm going to drop this phone right now or lay it down gently on the ground, which means God isn't all-knowing and all-powerful, and therefore also contradicts the existence of God. So all of this means that internally within the conception of God that they've given us, as an omnipotent being, it makes literally no sense to believe in God. Let's talk about science. We think that scientific proof is the best standard that we have to decide because science is both falsifiable, so you can make a statement such as there is an invisible pink unicorn behind me and it's either falsifiable or not, and it's verifiable, which is to say, it's verifiable, which is that falsifiable, I make a statement, I provide evidence and you can check whether that evidence is true or not. Given that this is the case, we think the burden of proof is on them to explain why evidence exists to suggest that God exists. Closing.
The universe is infinitely old. In that case, it would have taken infinity years to get to 2016, so it would never have got to 2016. How is the room that we're in epistemically possible?
2016 is a label we're placing for the time we live in right now. It could be any time. The next thing we tell you is that given that
given that science is a necessary, why do we know that science is something that's important? Because historically we've attributed so many things to God. If this debate was happening 300 years ago, we'd have said, look, eclipses happen, which is when, the sun goes, like the sun exists, but then a demon eats it, because God is angry at us. Or they would have said, look, diseases exist, which is people get sick because God thinks they've done something bad, and then they get better because God took care of them, because they prayed to God. We don't believe these things anymore because we have scientific evidence to show that it's not God that does it. It's things like germs and things like, the moon and the sun. I can't remember what exactly happens for decades. But all of that evidence suggests that we believe things about God historically that is simply not true, which is that we need to turn to disbelief rather than belief, given that they haven't given us any evidence to show why God exists. But let's look at the evidence that actually exists, right? Everything we know about God, that we can talk about God, is in the texts that God has left us in the form of different religious doctrines. That's the only evidence we can go on to understand what this God looks like, right? Couple of problems with this. First, any conception of God that they've given us is so human-centric that it simply doesn't make sense for God to exist. If God created the universe, there's no reason why God cares more about human beings, which is like one species on one planet in one corner of the universe, more than everybody else. Yet all the stories and beliefs and things that we think about God are so human-centric that it simply doesn't make sense. The second thing we tell you is that these are often massively contradictory, which is to say that Muslims believe that we shouldn't drink alcohol, Christians believe that you should wet the lips of a baby with wine. Like, these are two things that are inherently contradictory about God and what God believes that simply can't be true at the same time. Let's assume they say, oh, but this isn't what the debate is about because these are texts. If God existed, God could clarify which one of these was true and avoid all the pain and suffering that result from people believing stupid things about God. We think, given that logic exists and we think that God is all-powerful, there's no reason why God hasn't done that except for the fact that God doesn't exist, and these are simply stories that we've told to make ourselves feel better. The final thing we tell you is that if you come to competing conclusions based on similar standards, based on similar premises, we think that that's a reason to not believe anything. Given all of this, we think that in the next speech, they have to give us evidence to show that God exists and explain why, given the evidence that exists, God actually does. We're incredibly proud to oppose.
I'd like to make that speaker's remarks, call upon the Deputy Prime Minister to continue the case of the government bench. Here.
Tells us that the idea that things aren't real is absurd because it would cause us all to be able to do nothing because we don't know what's real. But that's exactly correct. I believe that we are all real because I don't want to think that I'm just ranting to an empty room or that none of you guys exist. So basically, every single belief is fundamentally a choice based on what we want. There is no belief that's based on fact. And even in their argument that this would lead to an absurd world in which we could make no choices is exactly true. It's why we choose to have certain beliefs. It's why every belief isn't based on rationality, but rather is based on our own choice. So, 3 questions in the round. First, in all probability, does a God exist? So based on pure facts, should you probably believe in God based on the balance of evidence? Second of all, what is belief? And therefore, if belief is, as we tell you, basically just a choice, do we want to believe in God based on that choice? So, first, in all probability, does a God exist? We tell you something cannot come from nothing. They tell you the universe is non-ending, so something never came from nothing because something has always been. The problem with this is an everlasting infinite universe going back into the past actually doesn't make sense, because how could we ever possibly have gotten to any particular point in time when things would have happened? We would have been stuck in this non-ending loop. But also, we tell you that the physical laws of their universe actually can't make this justifiable, because everything that exists needs to have come from something else. It needs to have started. Physical things would never have existed in the world. But the second thing is, we tell you the particular Earth that exists is uniquely improbable, right? So there need to have been the conditions for there need to have been the conditions for life, right? Just like very basic conditions for life. There needs to be an exact concentration of water on our planet, and then conscious life needs to have emerged from this. We tell you the very unique patterns of our Earth make it so that it's very improbable that unless there was some other conscious form controlling this, that this Earth would have even existed at all. But what does front half bring? They say, well, there's these logical contradictions in terms of what God exists and how it could possibly exist. They say there's a problem of evil. This runs into problems with our definition of God, right? Because we never say it's a benevolent God. We never even say it's an omniscient, omnipotent God who wants to make sure that everything goes right for us on the planet. It's totally possible, by the way, that there are multiple gods, right? So it's possible that this God is competing with other gods, for instance, right, on his or her, their higher plane of existence, and that on that higher plane of existence, there are other gods that are attempting to control our world and making it so that the God is in perfect control. It's also possible that this God is imperfect, right? Like this God could be omniscient and omnipotent, but want to create a world in which we suffer, or want to create a world in which we struggle with multiple religious texts. There's no reason to believe that the God that existed would want us to know the truth about that God, right? Like, it's totally possible that God would want to watch our fun debates about whether or not Islam or Judaism or any other religion is correct, and therefore would choose to do so. So all of their arguments are reliant on a conception of God which might not possibly be true. All we're saying is that you ought to believe in some sort of higher power. We're not specifying what type of higher power you should believe in. We just think, on balance, it's probable that it exists. Okay. Yeah, sure.
It might give my life more meaning not to believe in God that you suggest, but to believe that I am God. Is it a belief that I'm allowed to have, or a belief that makes sense for me to have?
Yeah, so I'd say it probably doesn't actually give your life more meaning to believe that you are God, because there'd be a lot of problems that would come from that, but that could be a whole other debate that we could have if the new resolution is this house believes that you are God, okay? So, the second question, what even is a belief? We say every belief fundamentally is a choice. That when we tell ourselves that our beliefs are based on logic, as they tell you, that's not actually accurate. So let's use the example which they give us. They tell you, basically, that you should make no assumptions until you know. The problem with this is you never actually know, because, right, like when you're trying to assess whether or not, like, that John dude is a good or bad person, basically you're trying to assess that based on sensory evidence. But as we told you, that evidence is fundamentally unreliable. So no matter how many conversations you have with John, you'll never actually know, like, who John is, what John is, whether or not John's real or a robot that's really manipulating your entire life. Okay, so given that all of this is true, we tell you that you actually have to make assumptions, that you constantly do make assumptions, that the things that we define as beliefs in our daily life are really assumptions which we're making and choices that we're making. Now, why do we make choices? We make choices because they allow our lives to have meaning, because they allow us to feel fulfilled, they make us happy, all sorts of stuff like that, right? Like, these are the fundamental underlying factors that cause us to make choices and allow us to have beliefs. We don't think it's based on any sort of rational proof that anyone can make, because we don't think it's reasonable for us in this round to say anything other than there's a strong probability that God exists. I don't think that we can be expected in this round to say it's an absolute certainty that God exists. There's no possibility that God does not exist. So, overall, we tell you, belief is really a choice, and why should you make this choice?
Question?
Well, because, yeah, sure.
So, if every belief is a choice, don't you need to first believe in the evidence to get to the probability of believing in God?
Yeah, so we think that you do believe in the evidence as provided in our first point, but we also think that at the point where you recognize that every belief is a choice, you don't even need to look at evidence. Rather, you can look inside yourself and see what you actually want to do as a person, right? So, like, we think when you try to look at evidence, in reality, you're not actually doing so. You're just making things up for yourself. Okay, so why do we want to believe in God? We tell you because belief allows you to live a meaningful life, right? Like, you as a person probably want this, like, you are probably a human being. We think this is why, in reality, most people choose to believe in God. We think that, basically, given that no one can prove or disprove God, and we're making this choice, this is how we should assess this round. So, why does belief allow you to live a meaningful life? They never respond to any of this. We tell you, basically, that now you're not like a tiny part of an infinitely long spectrum, that there's a possibility that you're actually immortal, that there's a possibility that the life before you is actually going to be meaningful, that you can actually impact the world around you. We also tell you free will is impossible without God. A potential response to this that we might get from back half is that free will is actually restricted by the existence of God, because God might control your actions. But the problem with this is, like, in a world without God, there actually is zero possibility of free will. While in the world with God, God can actually choose to give you free will. In a world without God, you're necessarily controlled by factors that are, like, not benevolent or have no interest in you, and therefore you actually are just the product of science, and therefore can make no decisions. So we tell you, you as a person probably want to believe in this. But finally, we tell you that believing in God is generally good for all of our societies, and so we continue to function. We tell you we're fundamentally creatures of evolution, whereby, right, like, we came about over time because we wanted to be able to continue to survive, and believing in God allows us to continue to survive as human beings. right? Not only does it allow us to believe that our lives are meaningful and we should continue to work to preserve those lives, but it also allows us to have societies to cooperate and stuff like that, right? Like the very basis of all of human society, like came from the fact that we were able to work together because we believed that the leaders in our communities were able to communicate with God, that incentivized us to cooperate with them rather than working against them, and actually created larger societies and more efficient governments. So overall, we think God probably does exist. Even if God doesn't exist, you should still believe in God just because it will make you happier. We're very proud to
I'd like to make a speak for the remarks, call upon the Deputy Leader of Opposition to continue the case of the opposition bench. Here, here.
I think a lot of this round comes down to what standard you use for belief. And though this is somewhat mischaracterized by side government in terms of what we actually think you should do in order to believe something, I think we give you a very reasonable standard, they give you a very counterintuitive standard. So 3 things in this speech. First, just what the standard for belief should be. Secondly, evaluating the round under best explanation. And thirdly, evaluating the round under their pragmatist notion that you should just believe things that are useful. So first, just what is the debate happening so far in the standard? They're basically advocating for a standard of pragmatism, like just believe something if you want it to be true. What we say is you should do something based on the best explanation. Notice, that does not mean something needs to be absolutely 100% true for you to believe it, just that based on the evidence you have, is it more likely that the thing you believe is true or not? Which means all their arguments about you can never be entirely sure are totally consistent with their best explanation paradigm, because we're not saying we don't have absolute proof God exists. Our argument is just very simply, we have no proof God exists, therefore the best explanation is he does not exist. We're not asking them to give us like a treatise on philosophy, we're just saying give us a concept that's not internally contradictory and some science proves it. They haven't met that very low bar. That's why we say best explanation. But what is theirs? Theirs is just like we should choose what people believe. But a couple of problems with this. Like, by this logic, people would, like, they support people believing in intelligent design because that's what they want to believe and that it's good. But there are problems with this. One is just very counterintuitive. Take, for example, I mistakenly see a dollar bill, I walk over there, and a piano falls right here, and I die. No one would say, like, it is true that that dollar bill actually exists, just that I'm mistaken. There's no reason why, like, we should base beliefs on truth. The second reason, though, and this is the reason, is because it would be contradictory, that sometimes we would believe in God when he's useful and does things like motivate us to give to charity, but we would stop believing in God when he's not useful and causes religious wars. That means that their standard for belief doesn't make any sense because truth would constantly change again and again and again, because what's useful constantly changes again and again and again, which means we don't think that is a good standard for truth. But then thirdly, I just think, like, you should probably believe things that have proof, because in general, if you're wrong, bad things will happen. For example, all the Europeans who once thought that, like, the Earth was the center of the universe, that was a disuseful belief because it was incorrectly based on, like, it prevented them from doing things like exploring earlier. We say that, like, if you're likelier to find out the truth, then that means you can get more knowledge, you can find out more possibilities, you can have more science. So in general, it's good to believe true things. So it would be internal to their argument. No. So under the round of best explanation, we told you 3 things. It's contradictory, there's no scientific evidence, and the evidence you do have is terrible. On contradictions, I'm just going to carry through Druva's argument that the idea of a greatest conceivable being is internally contradictory because it should have the power to make something as strong as itself, but then it would no longer be the strongest power in the world. Miriam gets up and says, oh, actually we can believe in multiple things or things that are incomplete. One, this just contradicts the POI, or point of clarification, I asked in the beginning of the round. Because if your notion of God keeps changing, like, and we can't accept that he's omnipotent, then we just cannot have a debate because we're debating 50 different things. But also this notion that there are, like, multiple gods fighting with each other is equally untrue. Because if that's true, we could probably attribute worldly events to conflicts between gods. But every worldly event, like a thunderstorm, we have then been able to attribute to things like science and weather patterns, as opposed to gods fighting with each other. So there's no reason to believe that there are multiple gods fighting with each other and God is evil and trying to spite us all. They say that the notion of an infinite universe is contradictory because we never get to hear. Druva gives a response they don't deal with, that time is just an arbitrary label. We started counting 2016 years ago in the arbitrary unit of a year. That's why we're here. But then they say physical things don't make sense. I actually think the concept that scientists have of entropy makes a lot of sense here. Forgive me, this has been like 5 years since I've studied this, but it's basically just that, like, disorder in the universe is static, so things constantly rearrange themselves, but the total amount of stuff stays relatively static. So the reason we have physical things is because particles are just recombining. The last thing is, like, how do we have the low probability of life? I think we explain this very well, because if there is an infinite universe, then low probability events make sense, because over an infinite span, eventually every possible thing will happen. So in the short time span we exist within infinity, it makes sense life exists. Closing.
1. Has Dawkins ever had a revelation of atheism? 2. Why does 1 plus 1 equal 2?
Sure. So for 1 plus 1 equals 2, it's because of the way we define the concept of 1 and the way we define 2. That is just starting from first principles. The problem is that the first principle of an omnipotent being is internally contradictory. There's nothing internally contradictory about the concept of 1. And then on I don't know. I don't care. Science. No response, they don't give you one, and I think we tell you, Druva gives you material that science is the best mechanism for determining best explanation because it's the only thing that's falsifiable and verifiable. Then, on evidence, we tell you the evidence is internally contradictory, which probably means there's no basis, because unlike every other field, like physics, where we do make progress, it just goes in circles with religion, because new religions develop over time, and they contradict each other, and new interpretations, and then people go back to old interpretations. We think all of that is bad. Finally, so third is believing in religion useful? Couple reasons. So just refuting all the things. They're like, basically you need religion to believe in all these other things because it's a useful belief. This is internally suspect because we can say just choose to believe in all those other things on their own as opposed to religion. Like just believe free will exists because it's like true as opposed to believing in God because that allows for a belief in free will. I think if people are choosing their beliefs, they just choose those concepts on their own, which is why we do have like secular ethics and human rights that people subscribe to without believing in God. 2 reasons religion's independently bad. First, it leads to conflict. Many people have different views of religion, and they often go to war over these conflicts, and it causes massive amounts of death and destruction, and because it's not based on anything real, you can never resolve these conflicts, so they become endemic. I think that causes a lot of problems. The second thing, in direct response to their argument about how you have internal guidance, is actually religion causes a lot of self-hatred and self-doubt. That because you think that you have to live up to some external plan, you always feel insufficient in the face of a Christian God. Let me not useful, because if all you care about is people believing in things they want to believe in, then they should just be hedonists and not they're based on I also think the last thing is their argument is like people need religion to provide guidance. But that's only because they've been conditioned to think they need religion in their life and they need a God. If we just tell people like, no, it's actually false, you shouldn't care, I think most people eventually would. The same way like children raised in atheist families like aren't like feeling existential dread and that there's no moment in their life. Because, 1, there is no proof for God, but 2, a belief in God itself would be harmful. We are so proud to oppose.
I'd like to take that speak for their remarks, call upon a member of government, continue the case of the government event, and open the back half of this debate. Here, here.
Yeah.
In the extension, we're going to explain to you how belief in God uniquely ties with set behaviour and why that behaviour is stronger and good for the individual, which is great about. Firstly, I've got quite substantial rebuttal, so let's get into that now. Okay, so the first thing that they told you to do is you should default, they told you 2 things. You should default to disbelief, not belief, and you should do something on the best explanation and fact. We just think that this isn't true, right? We think you should believe something based on like the benefits or the cost that having a certain belief would bring you. So if there was like very, very low chance if I walk across a parking lot at night, something very bad will happen to me. However, I would never ever walk across a dangerous parking lot at night because the chance of getting raped or murdered is sufficiently high that I want to do something to avoid that. Similarly, if there's any chance that God exists, and if there's a chance that believing in God means that you go to heaven as opposed to eternal damnation, then I think the benefits of believing in God is sufficiently high that there's any marginal possibility whatsoever, and the biggest benefit in the round is like eternal afterlife in heaven, and therefore you should always default to believe in this case because the benefits are incalculable and the costs are incalculably low. Okay, so the second thing that we've heard is omnipotence. Okay, look. Just because God was omnipotent at the beginning of the world does not mean he's omnipotent now. So if you give Bobby a gun, Bobby can kill herself. She has all the power she needs to do that. However, after she's made that decision, I'm talking myself in third person, unclear why, I then do not have the ability to go back and change my action. There are certain choices that I've chosen to constrain by taking that initial step, right? Similarly, we believe an omnipotent God, even though he was omnipotent in the beginning, can take steps to constrain his own power, such that there are things that he cannot do later on. This defeats all their argument about God not being able to hit a burrito, because should God choose to make, constrain his power such that he cannot eat the burrito, that is a decision he made, and that doesn't mean he wasn't omnipotent in the first place. We're talking about the first place thing. So then we told you, about the uncausable cause. That is, that if it is true that that there was an infinite existence before this moment in time, then it is impossible to get here because that would take infinitely long. All they had in response to this is this is an arbitrary label for all time. Regardless of the arbitrary label I put on this moment now, it still takes infinitely long to get to this moment now. It doesn't matter what I call it. I can call it A as opposed to 2016, and that argument will still be true. We just don't think that they beat that at all. Okay, so then they told us that you should base things on scientific evidence. I've already beaten this when if there's when I tell you about the harms calculus that comes into believing in God. But also recognize that science is based on arbitrary calculations, like the value we arbitrarily assigned to figure 1 and the value we arbitrarily assigned to figure 2. We think it's equally random, as we don't think that's necessarily something that you need to put right in. Then they told us that religion is bad. A couple of responses to this. So first, insofar as this debate about should an individual do it, as opposed to is religion writ large for the world a good thing? We don't think an actual individual believing in God is going to be a meaningful tipping point for religious wars across the globe. Insofar as we think what you should be weighing up is how this benefits you, we think that your eternal happiness is something to prioritize. And that's something that's for everyone to do. On case of go.
So on this Pascal's wager argument, if God is omnipotent, wouldn't he just be able to know if you're only choosing because it's useful, and then wouldn't that mean you don't go to heaven because it's not a sincere belief?
So firstly, we don't see a reason why God has to do things on faith. We think God can do things on the validity of your action. I probably don't, sometimes I don't choose to kill people because I'm scared of going to jail. Sometimes I don't drink because I'm scared of going to jail. That didn't mean that I didn't obey the law and do a net benefit to society that God can then judge things on. We think that's ridiculous. Okay, so now let's talk about moral incentives. Look, so as an individual, you want to put yourself into an arrangement that incentivizes you to behave a certain way, right? This is why, in this world, you can ask people to promise people that you would donate money to charity if you drink this month. That's how Alcoholics Anonymous and programs like that work. We think that because God is uncertain, because there's epistemic uncertainty, this encourages you to bind yourself to circumstances of behavior that you think will get you closer to heaven. We think this morality is likely to be best. Why? Because all morality is selfless, because humans do what's best for themselves, because we think what you aim to do in life is maximize your own pleasure. Okay. No, thank you. Religion in God is the only mechanism by which you can consistently cause people to act against their self-interest and their pleasure calculus on earth because they promise something infinitely good in the afterlife. We think this is good for individuals for several reasons. So firstly, insofar as you get more people buying into this calculus, you can convince more people to adhere to a set of rules that might encourage them to take into account other people's feelings more, which encourages better treatment towards other people, right? But secondly, we think it is good because it gives you unique comforts that you cannot access on their side of the house. So for example, should you be someone who has no meaningful human connection whatsoever on earth, the idea that you are being watched by someone who has some companionship, someone who can bring you a level of comfort that cannot exist on their side of the house. We don't think you have to buy into a set of logic that you're entirely alone in the universe and there's literally nothing on this planet that cares about you if it makes you less unhappy. Insofar as we think that belief in God can bring you companionship on some of the time, we think that that's a net benefit for your life. That's probably a good thing. So thank you. We also think that this encourages that you get altruism encouraged uniquely on our side of the house because there's very few systems that incentivize altruism because it's something you have to give up for no charity tip is something you give up for no benefit than feeling good. We think that insofar as people's amount they feel good, no thank you, is variance, this allows you to this actually gives you more incentive to do that. So now let's talk about other benefits, specifically social communities. So recognize that when you believe in God, you're allowed to adhere yourself to certain social communities that aren't inaccessible to you and then are going to be beneficial to you. Why are they going to be beneficial? Firstly, because those are people who share your values, recognize that belief in God is a means that you adhere to a certain set of moral principles and certain set of interpretations. These are also people that are bound by these interpretations to care for you, at least And if you have no one else or no other reason to get these, this gives one. Now, Danny wanted to tell us that this can be harmful sometimes because sometimes the beliefs of God that are put forward might make you think you're a sinner. So, for example, if you're a Christian and you are gay, that might cause you some internal conflict. Look, we think that there are many different interpretations of what it is to what it means to have a God. What the Bible means. The Bible is so full of internal contradictions that it's impossible to have one coherent meaning. What this means is there are many different branches of many different faiths. We think people are likely to pick the version of God and the version of morality that best benefits themselves because that is what brings them the most happiness in life. Given that you cannot really know what God meant when he was talking about a man life with a man, some people think it's underpopulation, some people think it's gay marriage. We think you're probably likely to go for the interpretation that it was underpopulation because that is the one that will bring you greatest happiness and personal benefit. We therefore don't think that people necessarily have to, or there was a pressure on them to buy into more frameworks that might be harmful to them. In fact, we think they've got great incentives to do so. We think that this therefore is another way in which this brings you comfort and happiness. Finally, we think knowing where you're going to go when you're going to go in the afterlife produces the uncertainty of going to hell or a mindless void that brings a lot of people a lot of internal torment in a very difficult way. Ladies and gentlemen, we think we've given you adequate reasons as to why you should vote to believe on our house. Given the only challenge we've got, this is the idea of God being omnipotent and the idea of infinity, both of which we've taken down, we know that insofar as there's a tiny chance that there is a God, the risk of not tailing yourself to a moral calculus are incalculable. You should therefore attempt to do it. It will also bring you tangible benefits in your living life when you get community and companionship that you cannot access on their side of the house. We are incredibly proud to do this.
I'd like to thank our speaker for the remarks. Call upon member of opposition to continue the case for the office from bench. Cheers.
We're going to prove to you that if God exists, they are evil, and at the point at which God is evil, you should not believe in that evil God. I want to respond to what we heard first from Closing Government, where they said you should defer to belief in God because that increases the chance of going to heaven. If God is not omnibenevolent, as OG concedes, there's no reason to think that that particular action is the tipping point at which you would access heaven. It could be an infinite number of different things that you're doing. In fact, not believing in God could be the thing that means you get to heaven. So at that point, you are paralyzed from action because you have no idea what thing is the certainty with which you are going to heaven. We think at that point, given it is uncertain, you should prioritize the certain thing, which is the current life you are living, and at the point at which the belief in God diminishes the quality of life you are currently having, you should not believe in that God. Okay, first argument, why God is evil. 4 points under this. First, if God is omnipotent, that means he knows evil will happen and refuses to stop it. At that point, God is an evil being. Second, God gave people free will, in which case he did this knowing that those people would use free will in order to commit evil acts. Third, if God didn't give people free will, in which case he chose to create a set of evil people, knowing with certainty that they would commit evil actions, he could have chosen to create a set of people who would only do good actions. So at that point, either way, either if he created people with free will or if he didn't, he did it in either case, guaranteeing that they would do evil actions. The fourth thing, which is I think the only good response they could have given, which they didn't, was that we need evil in order to fully understand good, and we need that comparison. That doesn't account for the amount of evil in the world to any extent. Why can't it be the case that you can understand good, which is a very small amount of evil in the world? It doesn't have to be the extent to which it is now. But it also doesn't account for the people who only know evil in their life. Those are individuals who never actually have good to counteract that evil. So at that point, why is God good? I think we've proven to you pretty sufficiently. I think OO gives you sufficient reason to believe that God doesn't exist, but we tell you if he does exist, he's definitely evil, and at that point there's no reason to defer to a belief in him. So, second argument, if God is evil, you should not believe in that God. Why is this? If God is evil, that means your suffering is meaningless because that God is not making you suffer for any larger purpose, but rather is only making you suffer because he's a vindictive asshole. Also, I just question why an omnipotent being would waste his time fucking around with human lives because it's satisfying to him. I really find this to be weirdly illogical. But we also tell you that at the point at which you feel, for instance, that your suffering is meaningful, it means you believe that you deserve to suffer, at which point you have terrible hatred of the self because you don't believe that suffering is you believe that suffering is warranted because God doesn't like you or because you did some action that isn't good. But if you believe in an irrational God, then you believe that that suffering is meaningless because God's just punishing you for the hell of it. But additionally, If God is as evil as they seem to presume, there's no reason to defer to believing because there's no certainty that he would be nice to you if you believed in him. So at that point, there's no reason to undertake that action. I think OG kind of shot themselves in the foot by being like, well, we don't know if he's good. Like, at that point, I think you should defer to an evil God because we have a whole hell of a lot of evidence, which OG likes a lot, that says he's pretty damn evil. But we also tell you, here's why it's so important that you resist believing at this God. At this point, the only way to resist this God is by refusing to believe in that unjust God because you have no power other than this. We think that at the point at which you refuse to believe in that God and don't seek pleasure from that God because he doesn't give a shit if you actually have pleasure in your daily life, your meaningful pleasure comes from interactions from other humans rather than meaningless affirmation from a fickle God. I think that's incredibly important because at that point it means that you actually seek out meaningful human-to-human interactions rather than defaulting to a belief in a God who you have no idea will actually treat you well. Sure.
Why would an evil God ever allow there to be any happiness in the world? And couldn't God be complex and have a lot of different feelings?
Literally any point, we point out any irrationality on your side of the house, you just say, well, there could be a different God where that could be true. That makes this debate incapable of happening. We have to have this debate presuming that there are some logical warrants for why God exists, and given you yourself tell us that we should use the evidence available to us in order to ascertain whether or not God exists, the vast majority of the evidence sides on the idea of God not existing, and if he does exist, he's probably pretty evil. But we also tell you that there's just enormous evidence that God is evil at the point at which he doesn't want you to be happy. Then we also get from CG this analysis where they're like, look, religion is the only thing that makes it so that you override your self-interest in order to do good things in the world. That's fascinating to me because it flies in the face of innumerable historical evidence which shows that, one, people oftentimes use religion to justify their self-interest in the form of using claims to God and religion in order to profit off of individuals, in order to occupy land, in order to murder other individuals because they say they're doing it for the benefit of them because God told them to. So at that point, it's totally unclear to me that religion also it makes us better to any extent. OG tells us, well, look, it's really good to believe in God because it makes you a moral actor, because it gives you a set of guidelines. This means that atheists cannot be moral actors. That's not true because I'm atheist and I think I generally undertake pretty moral actions, but I also think it's like literally what Christians tell people in order to scare them away from not believing in God. I'm not sure why like a Kantian framework of morals can't be as powerful to someone as a God framework of morals, because I think it all depends on what things you weigh as being most influential in your life. But I also tell you that at the point at which it doesn't make any sense, literally the morality God gives you makes no fucking sense. Like look at any of the texts because they're like, yeah, I mean that's fair, like we have to look at the text. There's so many different strains of religion. They all have insanely contradictory moral standpoints. So if that's the way you're adjudicating how you should set up your moral framework, it's a pretty bad one, because oftentimes it tells you that the thing that's most moral is owning slaves or whatever. Like, I'm not sure why this actually makes people more moral actors at the point at which the things that they're advocating for aren't even moral in the first place. I think at that point which you should defer to is a morality that is premised on a set of logical premises which you can prove and know, rather than a default to uncertainty, at which point you're out of order, at which point I don't think you can actually have any sort of conclusion. Essentially, government's line in today's debate was, we don't know, so therefore we should defer to believing. I think what we told you is, even if we aren't certain, we know that evil exists, and we know that if evil exists, God has the capacity to stop it, given they told us he was omnipotent. CG says, well, maybe he was omnipotent at first. Even if he was omnipotent at first, he created the world knowing that evil would exist later on after creating the world. So it doesn't matter if he's not omnipotent anymore at the point at which he was omnipotent when he decided to create a world in which he knew evil would happen. I think at the end of this debate, it's very clear that the only way you can resist the meaningless fickleness of an evil God is by refusing to believe that God and refusing to grant him the authority that he doesn't deserve. For these reasons, proud to oppose.
I'd like to take a speaker for remarks, call upon the government whip to close the case to the government bench. Hear, hear.
You know, when I started debate as a high schooler, my mum was a bit afraid of it because as a proud Catholic, she was a bit concerned that, and I quote, all these logical people will make you not want to go to church on Sundays. So I've really never been prouder to be standing defending the existence of a God in a debate round filled with probably the most atheistic group of people imaginable. Look, there are two personas that you can take, either one of which leads to a win for government bench. Firstly, you can be Ben Kornfeld. That is to say that you believe the foundations of your internal consistency and based on being put in a quiet room should determine whether or not you believe in a God. We're going to give you reasonable, plausible, logical reasons to believe from the base that given that, you should defer to believe in a God. Secondly, you can be Michael Dunn-Goikja, who has left for his train after listening to me speak. To that extent, you should preference your own general personal intuitions and go for those things that are likely to maximize your well-being. What we told you is that God serves as a convenient Ulysses contract that is socially enforced to ensure that you do exactly that. Before that, responses to Sia. Firstly, God exists and must be evil. They say he knows evil will happen, if free will, etc., he created evil people. Firstly, OG agreed that God is constrained by some foundations of logic, which is why God can't microwave a burrito that he is incapable of eating. That is to say, there are some constraints on the bounds of his possibility, and those constraints are what is logically permissible for humans to do. Otherwise, logic wouldn't exist, and this debate round would be pointless. What that means is that there are certain configurations of the world in which everyone is good, which are no longer possible. So, it is not unreasonable for us to assume the configuration of the world that we have is the only logically possible world that maximizes the overall happiness of the people within it. Secondly, there is substantial utility that individuals get from either freedom or some supposed notion of freedom. I am very happy because I get to choose the various different Uber types that I am allowed to use to get home. That is meaningful to me. I know David's looking frowning at me. I can't pay for it myself. To that extent, right, the fact that you have some meaning to those choices might have substantially great utility in the presence of a relatively small number of evil people. Recognize that in the world in general, people are immensely happy and have got vastly more happy over the course of time. It is just not true that large numbers of people are crying and sad relative to the numbers who existed in the past, and the world is generally on an arc towards better things. Thirdly, you need evil to know good, and they say, well, why not just a small bit of evil? I'm going to make the case the distribution for evil is symmetric with the distribution for good. That is, unless you see large amounts of evil and the worst kinds of evil, you cannot conceptualize what the best kinds of good are, because the human mind cannot multiply a little bit of evil by 10 to get a lot of evil, because it's very difficult to conceptualize of it until you see it. To that extent, therefore, you need to have the full spectrum of that. And it is just true that there is much more really good stuff in the world than really bad stuff. See the fact that every statistic to do with the quality of human life improves over time. Anyway, they would need to prove on top of that that you shouldn't believe in a God even if he's evil. They say he's vindictive and an asshole. One, if this is the case, why not just apply Stockholm Syndrome and do the thing which is most likely in a reasonable situation, giving a vindictive guy who is abusing you and 6 other billion people, why not do the thing that is most likely to make him happy, which probably is to be at least somewhat deferential to him, rather than sticking your nose up his ass and saying, F you, I'm going to go read Kant instead. Psycho on Kant. It just seems extraordinarily odd to me that Zoe thinks the comparative of this debate is reading the Bible and going to church with your friends, or sitting on your own reading Kant and deciding that's you and to conduct yourself. An absurdly high bar for the average individual to immerse themselves in, and not one that you can reasonably compare when we're talking about the median human in the world. The second thing to say is that interaction with humans, the very thing Zoe wants to substitute for interaction with God, is enhanced to the point when you're part of a religious community that incents you to prioritize social interactions over bettering yourself in every individual small time slice, which is the very animalistic instinct that is incentivized when you don't have a God and some fear of religion to check your personal motivated action. So, what would Ben Kornfeld say? They say, defer to disbelief. Their example is insane. If Druva didn't know MDG, he would believe, by their logic, in disbelieving that MDG was good, and disbelieving that MDG was bad, and therefore thinking that MDG was simultaneously not good and not bad, which presents exactly the same contradiction that they said we would have when you believe MDG is good and bad. Rather, therefore, apply heuristics to make sure you make some logical decision, given both sides are uncertain, but very improbable, all the way OG gives you, about how given the probability of this, God existing, given this world, is probably relatively high. But science, note, Danny's response to my 1 + 1 = 2 thing also applies to p-values and every single other conception of science, which means all of their coherentism science analysis is as arbitrary as whether God exists or not. So any of their stuff about logic defeating it is completely irrelevant. Bobby tells you 2 things. Firstly, that God solves the paradox of time, because whether we call 2016, or PQRZ, it's still infinitely far away from the supposed start of the universe that both op teams agree with. So accept at their strongest that the world is deterministic. They still need something at the start to have kicked that epistemic chain off, or else we could never have got to now. What we claim is that God sits orthogonal to that deterministic chain of events, and to that extent, therefore, was the uncaused original cause. But then he's not omnipotent. No, because there are many different deterministic chains the world could have taken, and God picked one before he decided to kick that chain off, and could reasonably have foreseen what they would have looked like. Easy proof for God. Secondly, God is a pretty good bet, because the vast majority of faiths at least put you in purgatory for the belief in the kind of happy-clappy God that OG wants us to model. They say, God knows this is why you did it. Like, okay, so maybe, but we still have Sodom and Gomorrah to disincentivize people in the Bible. It's not the case that God cares particularly about your motivation for faith so long as you believe, and if he does care a bit, he can at least put you in purgatory, which is a substantial lot better than eternal damnation in hell. So to that extent, it's probably a marginal win for our side. But what if God is evil? Then defer to Stockholm Syndrome, or at least doing something rather than sticking your nose up in the air and reading Kant. Thirdly, at least there is some evidence on our side. The POIR standing about Darwinian revelations is important, because to that extent, there is no evidence of people suddenly realizing atheism is true, but there is an awful lot of historical evidence of people being religiously motivated. So defer to the side that has at least some factual claims. Go.
Your argument is that suffering's decreased over time. Are you saying the world is better now that more people are secular, or 500 years ago when people went to war?
I don't think that has anything to do with religion, but rather the growth of technology that religion quite possibly facilitated. So, what might be better for you, given there's epistemic uncertainty as to whether God exists or not? Bobby tells you religion constitutes a rather effective Ulysses contract. Firstly, because unlike Danny's hedonism groups, they are likely to enforce you and stop you from leaving or disobeying God's contract. Secondly, because the stakes are both high and uncertain in the afterlife. What that means is you check people's animalistic instincts to maximize their utility in every interaction by screwing over individuals they receive, they meet in general interactions, and instead maximize for long-term utility by being generally nice to people, which is likely to be returned by other good favors towards you. That means that you're likely to interact better with people in the future and have better relationships. But also, I can't think of a world outside of this room where being religious makes you less socially liked. But I can think of lots of worlds in which being religious makes you more socially liked or less likely to be murdered or ostracized by your social community. So again, as the average reasonable individual, this seems a decent bet to take. They say, but wars. The comparative to religion here is ethnicity, which you can't opt in and out of and is likely to have far more bloody wars. But also, religions have strong incentives to moderate to reach the greatest base possible. So in general, they're likely to be more moderate than the median social norm that otherwise exists. To that extent, I think the case of being religious is hands down true, which is why I am.
I'd like to take that for the remarks, call for the opposite whip to close the case for the opposite events and the debate as a whole. Hear, hear.
So I'm a little confused that we started the government side with possibly the vaguest possible definition of God, and yet all of the benefits that the Gov Whip just told us we would get come from believing in very specific, very inconsistent, and very not necessarily good forms of God, be it Christianity, be it Islam, be it Hinduism, take your pick. All of the benefits that they apply of being religious require believing in something more than what they have set out for themselves to defend, something that they have admitted is internally inconsistent and cannot be reconciled with one another. I think that on face makes them lose this debate. But firstly, two themes. First, does God exist? Second, does it matter? So, on God's existence, OG says, on balance, the evidence, which also you have to choose to believe in, side note, points to you having to choose to believe in God because it is infinitely improbable that we have arrived at the world that we did today. So, first response, improbable things sometimes happen. Like the Cubs win the World Series, Trump might win, like tons of stuff happens that is very, very improbable. And I think that the response that we get to where Harry says, oh, well, this is the best possible world, therefore evil needs to exist, because since this is the one that exists, it is necessary to have evil and create it, etc., etc. I think that him saying that this is the best possible world, the only one that could have been created, is, if anything, knifing OG's point that it was immensely improbable for this world to be created. Because I think that saying that this world, as shitty as it is, exists, is just pointing to the fact that all of the improbabilities lined up in specifically the right way to give us everything that we see today, including this room and this debate. So, second and more important point, does it matter? So, opening government says, yes, because it makes life meaningful to believe in God. Now, they're still sticking by their very vague conception of God, so we don't get a whole lot of warranting as to why this makes your life more meaningful. They say that you can attribute cause to things, etc., etc. What Zoe tells you is that this actually makes your life less meaningful, because either you take all of the evil in the world and you say God is causing this, and all of these horrible things are happening not just to me, but to other people, and to people that I can sympathize with by virtue of our common humanity, and you say either God hates those people, in which case I think that it's pretty hard to square your belief in God with saying that people are suffering for, doing bad stuff, because not all of the people that suffer in the world are rapists and murderers. They're oftentimes children who don't get to experience the good. By the by, that's a rebuttal of the thing we got out of Harry, where he said, oh, we need an immense amount of evil because there's gradations. A lot of people to whom evil happens never get to experience that good, and so never get to make that comparative. Like if you're a baby that is born with cancer, you are never going to get the good that you would maybe realize if you were an adult that had cancer and made you realize the good within that life. So I don't think that good is necessary that evil is necessary to realize good. But furthermore, I think that the other option, the more plausible option, is that you accept that evil exists in the world, and you say, okay, so if God is controlling all of this, then God himself is evil. So in this case, it means that the suffering in your life is even more meaningless, because everything is happening essentially at random. Like if I trip and fall off the stage and I have to stay for the next month in the hospital, I don't know why that happened. Maybe it's just because God wanted it to, because he was looking around in New Haven, Connecticut, and he said, wow, that guy seems really awful. I'll just flick him off this stage. So I think that you don't actually derive any more meaning from religion, especially if you're using the vague conception of God that we got out of opening government. But then closing government comes up here and narrows the debate, and they say, but religion makes you better. So first of all, I'd like to note this is using a framework of beliefs, not just a belief in God. It's a belief in specifically the Christian God or the Islamic God. So first of all, actually back up.
So given the individual
Given you individuals can't understand suffering or change it, is it more comforting to read Kant or to join a community that gives you at least some solace of a better afterlife?
Okay, so I'll switch these things around. So they say that religion makes your human interactions more meaningful. I don't think this is the case for the very warrants that they provided about religion being a constraining feature on your actions. Because the point at which religion constrains your actions, it does so because you are making a cost-benefit analysis of the rewards and punishments that you may or may not receive in the afterlife based on various actions. That means that every interaction that you have with a human is based off of a cost-benefit analysis out of what is going to happen to you personally in the afterlife. So even if you buy that this is going to make people better, which I think there is immense amounts of evidence that it doesn't, see the Crusades or any kind of other religious warfare that has happened, I think that that's killed far more people than any kind of religious charity organizations helped. But even so, it means that you instrumentalize all of the human interactions that you have in order to get something personally beneficial to you out of it. So at the point at which the only consideration that you have in the world is whether or not you're going to go to heaven or hell, that immensely decreases the individual meaningfulness of every human interaction that you have, because you will never be able to attribute that to that person specifically or you yourself specifically, because you will be doing everything with an eye towards what is going to happen to you and your immortal soul. Sure.
Yeah. So even if God is evil, saying as believing does nothing at all, isn't it better to believe because that gives you a possibility of free will and a purpose in life, which is better?
All right, so the Pascal's wager is frankly ridiculous, because I think that there's no reason at the point at which God is accepted to be irrational and unknowable, there's no reason to think that belief is going to be the thing that lets you into the pearly gates. Harry says, well, oh, that's the reasonable thing to think. Yes, it's reasonable to us humans, but at the point at which OG and CG are conceding that God is unknowable and that their motives are unknowable, then there's no reason to defer based on a human framework. Maybe they can say, oh, it's the only one that they know, but I think that plenty of humans are terrible and vindictive and inconsistent, and there's no reason to think that the individual act of belief is going to be the thing that saves you. But furthermore, what we tell you is that because God is evil and inconsistent, the only thing that you can possibly do is disbelieve. And that is the thing that you should do, because it is a lone act of resistance against this evil force in the world. Because you cannot understand God, because you cannot interact with them, you have no way of knowing if any of your actions interact with that being, and you have no way of knowing whether or not you fight back against that evil force within the world. The only way that you can possibly know that you are affecting God is if you say, I do not believe or attribute any of the things in the world to your power. Saying that you believe in someone just because they have power over you is just an argument for me believing in Barack Obama because he could theoretically put me in jail. It's not a justification for a belief in an omnipotent God. For all these reasons, very proud to.
I would like to ask you for the remarks. So I thank everyone in the debate for an excellent debate. Can we all give a round of applause one more time?